The slap echoed through the frozen street like a gunshot. Nathan Crawford's hand froze on the reins of his horse. 20 feet away, under the glow of a street lamp, cutting through the December blizzard, he saw her. A woman on her knees in the snow, her cheek already swelling red. 3 small boys huddled behind her, their faces pressed into her skirts. And standing above them, on the steps of his fine brick house, was Marcus Harland, Banker Town Council member, pillar of Clearwater society. The door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Nate had been riding past, heading home to Red Mesa Ranch after selling cattle in town. He should have kept going. He had his own problems, his own ghosts, his own reasons to avoid entanglement with strangers and their troubles. But something in the way the woman slowly pushed herself up from the snow, something in the careful way she turned to gather her children, something in the absolute silence of her dignity, made him dismount. His boots crunched through 8 inches of fresh powder. The wind howled down Main Street, carrying the promise of a killing storm. The temperature had already dropped below zero. By midnight, it would be cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, cold enough to kill a woman and 3 children with nowhere to go. Marcus noticed him first. The banker's expression shifted from satisfaction to wariness as Nate approached. "Crawford, this doesn't concern you." Nate didn't answer. He walked straight to the woman, offered his hand. She looked up at him through eyes that had seen too much, trusted too little. Dark hair plastered to her face by melting snow, lips blue with cold. But her gaze was steady, calculating, weighing him against every man who had ever made promises and broken them. She didn't take his hand. She stood on her own, pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and stepped between Nate and her children, protecting them, even from potential help. Nate turned to Marcus. "How much does she owe you? I told you this isn't your business. I'm making it my business. How much?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew Nate Crawford. Everyone in Clearwater knew Nate Crawford. War veteran, successful rancher. A man who kept to himself but commanded respect through sheer competence and an unspoken capacity for violence that lingered in his movements like a coiled spring, not someone to cross lightly. $300, Marcus said finally. "Her late husband's debt. She can't pay, so she's no longer family." "Late husband?" Nate repeated, his voice flat. He looked at the woman. "You're his sister-in-law?" She nodded, once her chin lifted in defiance of the humiliation. "James was his brother. He told me if anything happened, Marcus would help." "Help?" Marcus sneered. "I offered her employment, housekeeper, room and board. She refused." Something in the way he said it made Nate's hands curl into fists. He had heard that tone before, seen that look in men's eyes. Employment without wages, room and board in exchange for servitude that wouldn't end, couldn't be escaped. A cage with a key only the keeper held. Nate reached into his coat, pulled out the leather billfold he carried, and counted out $300 in territorial script and gold certificates. The entire profit from his cattle sale. Money he had planned to use for spring seed and new breeding stock. He held it out to Marcus. "Now she doesn't owe you anything." Marcus stared at the money, his face flushing with rage beneath the cold. "You're making a mistake, Crawford. A big one. Take it or don't. But she's done with you either way." For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Then he snatched the bills from Nate's hand, his fingers trembling with barely suppressed fury. "I'll remember this," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're some kind of hero, some white knight saving a damsel in distress. She'll bleed you dry, Crawford. Women like her always do, and when she's taken everything, when you're broken and desperate, I'll be there to watch you fall." Nate stepped closer, close enough that Marcus had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. Close enough that the banker could see exactly what kind of man he was threatening. "Get inside your house, Marcus, before I forget we're in town." Marcus retreated, his expensive boots slipping on the icy steps. He slammed his door hard enough to rattle the windows, but Nate could see him watching from behind the curtains, planning, calculating. Marcus Harland was not a man who accepted defeat. He would retaliate. The only question was when and how. Nate turned back to the woman. She hadn't moved, hadn't relaxed her protective stance in front of her children. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity that felt like being weighed on scales that had judged too many men and found them wanting. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice was rough from cold but steady. "You don't know if I'm worth $300. You don't know if I'll disappear in the night with whatever I can carry." "No," Nate agreed. "I don't." "Then why?" The wind gusted between them, carrying snow that stung like thrown sand. Nate looked at the three boys. The oldest, maybe 9 or 10, stood with his shoulders squared and his jaw clenched, trying to be the man he thought his mother needed. The middle one, 6 or 7, had tears frozen on his cheeks, but made no sound. The youngest, barely 4, shivered so violently his teeth chattered like dice in a cup. "Because 15 years ago," Nate said quietly, "someone didn't help my wife when she needed it, and now she's dead. I won't make that mistake again." Something flickered in the woman's expression. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. "I have a cabin," Nate continued, "at my ranch, 3 miles northeast. It's got a working stove beds and a door that locks from the inside. You and your boys can stay there tonight. Tomorrow, if you want, we can talk about work." "What kind of work?" "I need a teacher for the ranch children. 6 families, 14 kids, total ages 4 to 12. I'll pay $40 a month plus room and board. You can use the wages to pay me back for what I gave Marcus. Fair trade for fair work, not charity, not debt, just business." The woman studied him for another long moment. Nate could see her calculating, weighing risks, assessing options. She was smart, cautious, desperate enough to be dangerous to herself if she made the wrong choice. Finally, she looked down at her oldest son. "Daniel." The boy met her eyes. Some wordless communication passed between the mother and child who had learned to survive by reading each other's signals. "I'm cold, Mama," Daniel said. Not a complaint, a fact, permission. The woman looked back at Nate. "My name is Eleanor Morrison. Ellie. These are my sons, Daniel Matthew and Benjamin. Nathan Crawford. Most people call me Nate. Mr. Crawford, if I get in your wagon, if I go to your ranch and you try to hurt me or my boys, I will kill you. I've done it before. I can do it again." She hadn't done it before, Nate could tell, but the fact that she could say it, could meet his eyes while she said it, told him everything he needed to know about what she had survived to get here. "Understood," he said. "And Mrs. Morrison, if I do anything to make you uncomfortable, there's a rifle in the wagon. It's loaded. You're welcome to it." He walked to his wagon, brought it around. The boys climbed into the back without being told, moving with the practiced efficiency of children who had learned not to cause trouble, not to take up space, not to be noticed. Ellie hesitated at the wagon step, her hand on the frame. "Why Red Mesa Ranch?" she asked. "I've heard of it. You run cattle. Good operation. You don't need a teacher badly enough to pay a stranger $40 a month." "No," Nate admitted. "I don't need one that badly, but the children need one, and you need a way to be independent. This solves both problems." "Nothing solves both problems. There's always a catch. The catch is you have to actually teach them, and you have to stay long enough to do it properly. That enough of a catch for you." Ellie almost smiled. Almost. Then she climbed into the wagon and sat as far from him as the bench would allow, her body angled, so she could watch him and the road simultaneously. Nate clicked the reins. The horse moved forward, hooves muffled by snow. Behind them, Marcus Harlan's house receded into the white darkness. Ahead, 3 miles of storm and uncertainty. They rode in silence for the first mile. The boys had already fallen asleep in the wagon bed, exhausted by terror and cold, and the cruel mathematics of survival. The canvas Nate had pulled over them would keep off the worst of the snow, but he could hear the youngest whimpering in his sleep. "Your husband," Nate said, finally pitching his voice low so it wouldn't wake the children. "Mining accident. Collapsed shaft. Montana Territory. 8 months ago." Ellie's voice was carefully neutral, grief pressed flat by necessity. "He was trying to make enough money to move us somewhere better. Somewhere the boys could go to school, have opportunities. Instead, he left us with $300 in debt and a letter telling us to go to his brother. Marcus. James trusted him, said Marcus was hard but fair, said he'd take care of us if anything happened." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "James was wrong about a lot of things. Nate knew that kind of wrong, the kind that got people killed, the kind that left survivors holding pieces that would never fit back together. Marcus wanted more than housekeeper work," he said, not a question. Ellie didn't answer for a long moment. Then, so quietly he almost missed it over the wind, he said, "James promised me to him, in writing, that if the debt couldn't be paid I would work it off. He showed me a letter, James's handwriting, his signature. Was it real? I don't know, maybe. James was desperate at the end, trying anything to get us out of the mines, or maybe Marcus forged it. Does it matter? The law would believe him over me, banker's word against a penniless widow." The wagon jolted over a hidden rut. Nate steadied it, kept them moving forward. 2 miles to go. The ranch lights would be visible soon if the snow cleared enough. "You said you killed someone before," he said. "Was that true? Would you turn the wagon around if it was—" "No, but I'd like to know." Ellie pulled her shawl tighter. "In the mining camp, a man tried to force himself on me. 3 months after James died. He thought I was desperate enough, weak enough, that I wouldn't fight back. I broke his skull with a cast-iron pan. He lived, but he's simple now. Can't remember his own name most days. The camp law said it was justified, self-defense. But I remember the sound it made. I remember how easy it was. And I know I could do it again if I had to." "Good," Nate said. She looked at him, sharply. "Good. You're a survivor. You do what needs doing. That's the kind of woman who can make it out here, the kind who can teach children not just letters and numbers, but how to be strong when the world tries to break them. Is that what you're looking for? Someone to teach your ranch children to be hard? No. I'm looking for someone to teach them to be strong and kind. There's a difference. Hard is easy. The world makes you hard whether you want it or not. Kind takes courage, takes choice." Ellie was quiet for another quarter-mile. Then, "Your wife, what was her name?" "Sarah." "How did she die?" Nate's hands tightened on the reins. This was the part he didn't talk about, the part he had spent 5 years trying to bury under work and isolation and the careful construction of a life with no room for feelings that might break him. "Scarlet fever 5 years ago. I was in Montana buying breeding cattle for the ranch. I was gone 6 weeks. When I got back, she'd been dead for 3 days. Buried alone because everyone else was too scared of infection to come to the funeral. Joe, my foreman, he did it. Dug the grave himself. Put her in the ground in the dress she wore when we got married. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was my fault. She asked me not to go. Said she had a bad feeling. But I went anyway because I thought I knew better. Thought the ranch needed those cattle more than I needed to listen to my wife's intuition." His voice went rough-fractured at the edges. "I was wrong, and she paid for my arrogance. That's not fault, that's just life. Cruel timing and bad luck. Maybe, but I've had 5 years to think about it, and I keep coming back to the same thing. I wasn't there when she needed me. I chose business over her, and that choice killed her as surely as the fever did." The ranch appeared ahead, lights glowing warm through the snow. 3 barns, the main house, and several smaller cabins scattered across what Nate knew was hundreds of acres of grazing land. In summer, it was beautiful. In winter, it was brutal and unforgiving, and exactly the kind of place that broke weak people and forged strong ones. "That's why you helped us," Ellie said. "Because we're your second chance, your redemption." "No," Nate said as he guided the wagon toward the southernmost cabin. "You're not my redemption. You're your own people with your own lives and your own choices to make. But maybe if I can help you survive, if I can give you a chance to build something real, then Sarah's death won't be completely meaningless. Maybe it'll be a lesson I actually learned instead of just another regret." He stopped the wagon in front of the cabin. Light already glowed through the windows. Joe must have seen them coming, prepared the space. The old man understood things without needing explanations. Nate climbed down, then helped the boys from the wagon bed. They woke confused and frightened, but Daniel immediately took charge, herding his younger brothers toward the cabin door. Ellie remained on the wagon seat. "I meant what I said. If you try anything, I'll kill you. I know. And I can't promise I'll stay. If this doesn't work, if I find something better, I'll leave. That's fair. And I won't sleep with you. I don't care how long I'm here or how much you do for me. My body is not payment for anything." "Mrs. Morrison." Nate said, meeting her eyes directly, "I have a housekeeper named Martha who was my wife's best friend. She lives in the main house. I sleep in the stable most nights because being in that house without Sarah is like living in a grave. The last thing on earth I want is to sleep with anyone. All I want is for those boys to be warm, for you to be safe, and for this to be the last time I have to watch someone freeze because no one gave a damn. Is that clear enough?" Ellie studied his face in the lamplight. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied something, because she finally nodded and climbed down from the wagon. Inside the cabin, Joe had indeed prepared everything. The stove blazed with heat. 2 beds were made up with clean quilts. A pot of stew sat warming on the stove top. Bread, butter, and milk waited on the small table. "There's a bolt on the inside of the door," Nate said from the threshold. He wouldn't enter, wouldn't cross that boundary. "Lock it. Martha will come by in the morning with breakfast. If you need anything before then, the main house is the big building you can see from the window. Joe sleeps there. He's armed and he's light sleeper, so if anyone bothers you, just yell." "Where will you sleep?" "Stable. I told you. It's where I sleep most nights anyway. In a blizzard. I've slept in worse. I'll be fine." Ellie looked like she wanted to argue, but Daniel had already claimed one bed for him and his brothers, and Matthew was crying quietly with relief at the warmth, and Benjamin was staring at the food like he couldn't believe it was real. "Thank you," Ellie said, finally, "for tonight, for this, for not being Marcus. You're welcome. And Mrs. Morrison, you don't owe me gratitude. You don't owe me anything except honest work for honest pay. Everything else is just being a decent human being, and that's a pretty low bar." He left before she could respond, pulled the door shut behind him. Heard the bolt slide home. Good. She was learning to protect herself, to claim space, to set boundaries. That was the first step towards surviving and eventually thriving. The stable was cold but dry. Nate's horse whickered a greeting as he entered, nosing at his pockets for the sugar cube that was usually there. Tonight there was nothing. He had given everything to a woman and 3 boys he didn't know for reasons he wasn't entirely sure he understood. He spread hay in an empty stall, pulled a wool blanket from the tack room, and settled in for the night. From his pocket he withdrew the photograph he always carried. Sarah, 23 years old, smiling at the camera with all the hope and faith of a woman who believed her husband would keep her safe. "I couldn't save you," he whispered to the image, "but maybe I can save them. Maybe that's enough." The stable door creaked open. Joe stood silhouetted against the snow, his weathered face unreadable in the shadows. "That's a whole lot of trouble you just bought yourself, boss. I know. Marcus Harlan doesn't forgive, doesn't forget. He'll come after you for this. Let him come." Joe stepped inside, closed the door against the storm. "Who is she?" "Widow. 3 boys. Marcus's sister-in-law. He was trying to force her into servitude. And you paid her debt?" "Yes." "With the cattle money?" "Yes. That was supposed to go toward the spring mortgage payment." Nate looked up at his old friend, his mentor, the man who had saved his life in the war and stayed by his side through everything after. "I know what it was supposed to do. I made a choice." Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down in the hay beside Nate, pulled out his pipe, and began the familiar ritual of packing it with tobacco. "Sarah would have done the same thing," he said finally. "I know, that's why I did it. Or maybe you did it because you're finally ready to stop punishing yourself for being alive when she's not." Nate didn't answer, couldn't answer, because Joe was right, and admitting it felt like betraying Sarah all over again. They sat in silence while the storm raged outside, and 3 boys slept warm for the first time and who knew how long, while their mother stood watch over them, while somewhere in town Marcus Harlan stared at $300 and planned revenge, while the future hung balanced between mercy and consequence, between the choice to help and the price that choice would demand. In the cabin, Ellie Morrison stood at the window long after the light in the stable went dark. She watched the snowfall and wondered what kind of man gave everything to strangers, wondered what he really wanted, wondered if she had made a terrible mistake or caught the first piece of luck she had seen in 8 months. Daniel appeared at her elbow, silent and serious. "Mama, is it good, that man?" Ellie thought about the question, about Nate's steady voice and sad eyes, about the way he had stood between her and Marcus without being asked, about the $300 he had handed over like it was nothing when it was clearly everything. "I think he's trying to be," she said finally, "and maybe that's close enough." Morning came with 3 sharp knocks that rattled the cabin door like gunfire. Ellie jerked awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept under her pillow. The boys stirred in their bed, Daniel already sitting up with that too old alertness of a child who had learned to wake ready for danger. "Mrs. Morrison," a woman's voice, brisk and no nonsense. "I'm Martha Hayes. Got breakfast here and it's getting cold." Ellie crossed to the door, checked through the gap in the curtain. A woman stood on the porch, perhaps 55 or 60, built solid as a brick house with steel gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful. She held a covered basket in both hands and had the expression of someone who did not appreciate being kept waiting. Ellie opened the door. Martha pushed past without invitation, set the basket on the table, and turned to assess Ellie with eyes that missed nothing. The scrutiny lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt comprehensive as a medical examination. "You didn't sleep," Martha said. "It wasn't a question. I can see the bags under your eyes, and that chair by the door, you moved it there to barricade. Smart, but unnecessary. No one's going to bother you here. You don't know that. I know Nate Crawford, known him 15 years, and I know he'd sooner cut off his own arm than let harm come to someone under his protection. Martha began unpacking the basket, fresh bread still warm, butter jam, a pot of coffee wrapped in towels to keep it hot, and scrambled eggs in a covered dish. Sit down. We need to talk. Ellie remained standing. About what? About the fact that you're here, about what that means, about the work Nate offered, and whether you can actually do it. Martha poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the table. Sit. I don't bite unless provoked. Slowly, Ellie sat. The coffee smelled like heaven. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. Martha settled across from her with the air of a woman about to conduct an interview. Can you actually teach, or was that a convenient lie? I taught school for 4 years, back in Pennsylvania before I married James. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, children ages 6 to 14. Why'd you stop? Because James asked me to marry him and move west. Because I was young and stupid and thought adventure was more important than stability. You regret it. Ellie thought about her 3 sleeping sons, about the good years before the mines, about James's laugh and his dreams and his absolute certainty that the next claim would be the one that paid off. No, but I regret that he died chasing fool's gold instead of building something real. Martha nodded, something like approval in her expression. Nate told me about Marcus, about the $300, about the debt. I'll pay it back. I know you will. You've got that look. Pride stronger than sense. Martha sipped her coffee. But here's what you need to understand about Nate Crawford. That man's been dead inside for 5 years, walking, talking, running this ranch, but dead where it matters. You know why? His wife died. Sarah. My best friend since we were girls. Sweetest woman you'd ever meet. Kind to everyone, even people who didn't deserve it. And she loved Nate like he hung the moon and stars. Martha's voice went rough. I was there when she died, held her hand. She kept calling for him, kept asking when he'd be home. She died still waiting. Ellie felt something cold settle in her stomach. And you blame him. I did. For a while. But Sarah wouldn't want that. She'd want him to live, to be happy, to find purpose again. Martha leaned forward. Last night was the first time in 5 years I've seen him make a choice that wasn't about punishing himself. You and those boys, you're not charity to him. You're a chance at redemption. I don't want to be anyone's redemption. Good, because that's not the job. The job is teaching ranch children their letters. 3 days a week, Monday through Friday rotation with Wednesdays off. $40 a month plus this cabin and provisions from the ranch stores. You work, you earn, you pay back the debt over time. Fair exchange. And when the debt's paid, then what? Martha smiled sharp and knowing. Then you decide if you want to stay or go. But my guess is by the time that debt's clear, you'll have found reasons to stay that have nothing to do with money. Before Ellie could respond, the boys emerged from the bedroom. Benjamin made a beeline for the food. Matthew hung back shyly, and Daniel positioned himself between his brothers and Martha like a young guard dog. It's all right, Ellie told him. This is Mrs. Hayes. She works for Mr. Crawford. I work with Mr. Crawford, Martha corrected. There's a difference. Now sit down, all of you. Can't have children going hungry on my watch. They ate in near silence, the boys shoveling food with the desperate efficiency of children who had known real hunger. Martha watched them with something soft in her expression, though she hid it quickly when she noticed Ellie looking. After breakfast, Martha stood. Get yourself settled today? Tomorrow Daniel comes with me to the stable. Nate's going to teach him ranch work. Daniel's head snapped up. Ranch work, real work. Real as it gets. Feeding stock, mucking stalls, learning to rope. If you prove yourself, there might be riding lessons too. And he'll pay me? $5 a month, same as the other boys who help out. You'll earn every penny. Ellie saw her son's face transform. Not just excitement, but something deeper. Purpose. The chance to contribute instead of being a burden. She wanted to refuse to keep him close and safe, but she understood what this meant to a 9-year-old boy who had spent 8 months watching his mother struggle. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. Martha's expression softened completely for just a moment. Thank Nate. He's the one who suggested it. After she left, Ellie stood at the window, watching the ranch come alive with morning work. Men moved between buildings, horses were led from stables, smoke rose from the main house chimney. It looked organized, prosperous stable. Everything the mining camps had never been. "Mama," Matthew tugged her skirt, "are we staying here? For now, sweetheart? Is it safe?" She looked down at her middle son, at the fear that had lived in his eyes since his father died. "I think so, but we stay careful, all right. We watch and we learn, and we don't trust too easily." "I like Mr. Nate," Benjamin announced, from where he was playing with a wooden horse someone had left in the cabin. "He has kind eyes." Out of the mouths of children, Ellie thought. But Benjamin was right. Nate Crawford did have kind eyes, sad and haunted, but kind. The question was whether kindness would be enough when whatever storm Marcus Harland was brewing finally broke. At 10 o'clock, Daniel appeared at the stable as instructed. He found Nate inside cleaning saddles with methodical precision. The man looked up when Daniel entered, and for a moment the boy saw something raw in his expression before it smoothed into neutral courtesy. "You came," Nate said. "Yes, sir." "Just Nate. No need for sir." He set aside the saddle, stood slowly. His movements were careful, controlled, like a man who had learned to live with old injuries. "Martha said you wanted to learn ranch work. I want to earn money, to help Mama pay back what she owes. Your mother doesn't owe me anything she can't pay back through teaching wages. This job is separate. This is for you, not for her debt." Daniel frowned, trying to understand. Then why offer it? Because a boy your age should have work that teaches him skills, gives him purpose, makes him feel like part of something. Because idle hands make for troubled minds. Because I remember being 9 years old and desperate to prove I was man enough to matter. Nate picked up a rope from the workbench. And because teaching you to work a ranch properly takes time and attention, which means you're earning every dollar I'll pay you. He led Daniel outside to the nearest corral where several horses grazed. An older man was already there, weathered as old leather and twice as tough-looking, watching them with sharp interest. "This is Joe Whitaker," Nate said. "He's been with me 20 years. Taught me most of what I know. Joe, this is Daniel Morrison." Joe studied Daniel with the same thoroughness Martha had used on Ellie. "Boy's got his mama's eyes. Cautious, that's good. Stupid people don't last long on ranches." "I'm not stupid," Daniel said, more defensive than he intended. "Prove it. Tell me what you see when you look at those horses." Daniel looked. 5 horses, all different colors and sizes. He tried to think what Joe wanted to hear. "They're eating." "That's what they're doing, not what they are. Try again." Daniel looked harder. Noticed details. That brown one stands apart from the others. The black one keeps watch while the others graze. The spotted one has a limp. Joe's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. "The brown one's new, doesn't trust the herd yet. Black one's the alpha mare, protects the group. Spotted one stepped wrong yesterday, needs poultice on that foreleg. You see the world around you. That's the first requirement of good ranch work." Over the next 2 hours, they taught Daniel the basics: how to approach a horse without spooking it, how to check hooves for stones and injury, how to measure feed and distribute it fairly so the aggressive horses didn't steal from the gentle ones. Daniel absorbed it all with fierce concentration, determined to prove himself worthy. By noon his hands were raw and his back ached, but pride burned in his chest. He had done real work, adult work. When Nate paid him 50 cents at the end of the session, calling it an advance on his first month's wages, Daniel held that coin like it was pure gold. "Same time tomorrow," Nate said. "And Daniel, don't spend that 50 cents yet. Save your money. Teach your brothers to save theirs when they're old enough to earn. Wealth isn't about how much you make. It's about how much you keep." "Yes, sir. I mean, Nate." Walking back to the cabin, Daniel felt taller somehow, a man with wages, a man with purpose. He couldn't wait to show his mother the coin to prove he could contribute to ease even a fraction of the burden she carried. But in town 7 miles away, Marcus Harland sat in his bank office with a very different kind of purpose burning in his chest. Reverend Isaiah Stone sat across from him, a thin man with pale eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime in childhood. He wore his faith like armor, wielded it like a weapon, and found sin wherever looking would profit him most. "You're certain about this?" Stone asked, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "Completely. Crawford thinks he can humiliate me, publicly steal what's rightfully mine, and suffer no consequences." Marcus pulled out a ledger, opened it to a marked page. "But I've been patient. I've been planning. And now it's time to act. What exactly do you propose?" "Sunday sermon. You're new to Clearwater, establishing your authority. Perfect time to address moral standards in the community." Stone's eyes sharpened with interest. "Go on." "A widow living on an unmarried man's property. 3 children exposed to improper arrangements. The appearance of sin is as damning as sin itself. Wouldn't you agree, Reverend? The Bible is clear on matters of propriety. Exactly. And the community will listen to you. They'll demand something be done. They'll question whether Mrs. Morrison is fit to raise those children in such circumstances, and if Crawford marries her to silence the scandal. Marcus smiled, cold and calculating. Then we move to phase 2. But I don't think he will. Nathan Crawford has been mourning his dead wife for 5 years. He's not going to suddenly marry a stranger to save her reputation. He'll try to weather the storm to rely on his good standing in the community. That's when we strike. How? Crawford's ranch mortgage, $5,000 due March 1st. That's 3 months from now. If he has a strong winter, sells his cattle in spring, he can make the payment. But if buyers won't work with him because his reputation is destroyed, if his workers leave because their families don't want children around moral corruption, if the bank examines his accounts more closely and finds, let's say, irregularities, then he defaults. Stone leaned back, understanding dawning. And the bank forecloses. I am the bank. When he loses everything, Mrs. Morrison will have nowhere to go, except back to me as her late husband promised. Marcus produced a letter from his desk drawer. I have documentation. James Morrison agreed before he died that if anything happened to him, I would care for his family. In writing. The letter was a forgery, carefully crafted to match James's handwriting from bank documents Marcus had collected over the years. But Stone didn't need to know that. All he needed to know was the leverage it represented. What do you want from me? Stone asked. Start with the sermon, plant seeds of doubt, let the community do the rest. I'll handle the financial pressure. Between us, Crawford will be ruined by spring. Stone was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with whatever remnant of conscience still lived behind his calculating eyes. $10,000 for the new church building fund? $5,000. 8, and I want it in writing before I begin. Marcus considered. $8,000 was steep, but Red Mesa Ranch was worth 10 times that. The land alone was prime grazing territory. And Eleanor Morrison, she was worth the price all on her own, not for any affection or desire, but for the principle. She was his by right, by promise, by debt. Crawford had stolen what belonged to Marcus, and there was a price for that theft. Done. I'll have the contract drawn up today. They shook hands, 2 men united in self-interest and wrapped in the language of righteousness. Outside the office window, Clearwater went about its business, unaware that its newest minister and most prominent banker had just conspired to destroy one of its most respected citizens. That Sunday, the church was packed. Families crowded the pews, their best clothes slightly worn but carefully maintained. Wyoming Territory was a hard place that bred hard people, but it also bred community, the desperate need to gather together against the isolation and brutality of frontier life. Ellie sat in the back row with her boys, acutely aware of the whispers that started the moment she entered. She had debated not coming, but Martha had insisted that hiding would only fuel speculation. Better to show her face, demonstrate propriety, let people see she had nothing to hide. Nate was not there. He never attended services, Martha had explained, not since Sarah's funeral, when half the town had been too afraid of infection to come pay respects. He had never forgiven the congregation for that absence, had never stepped foot in the church again. Reverend Stone took the pulpit with the confident bearing of a man who knew his audience and how to manipulate them. He began with familiar scripture, comfortable passages about family and faith. Then his tone shifted. But what happens, he said, his voice rising with practiced passion, when the very foundation of family is threatened, when the sanctity of God's design is perverted by arrangements that mock his law? Ellie felt ice form in her stomach. She knew where this was going. Today, on the Lord's Day, let us speak plainly about the dangers that face our community, about a woman barely widowed who has taken up residence on the property of an unmarried man, about children exposed to living arrangements that defy every principle of Christian morality. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Heads turned, not quite looking at Ellie, but making it clear they knew exactly who Stone meant. Some call it charity, Stone continued, warming to his theme. Some call it kindness, but I call it what God calls it, sin. The appearance of evil is as damaging as evil itself, and when we allow such arrangements to exist unchallenged, we invite corruption into our very midst. Daniel's hand found Ellie's, squeezing tight. She squeezed back, forcing herself to sit straight, to meet the eyes of anyone brave enough to look at her directly. She would not cower, would not run. That would only prove Stone right. I call upon this community to examine whether such circumstances are appropriate for raising children, whether exposure to moral ambiguity serves the best interests of young souls who deserve better, whether we as people of faith have an obligation to intervene when we see innocence threatened. It was a masterful performance, not quite an outright accusation, but clear enough that everyone understood the implications. By the time Stone finished his sermon, the church buzzed with scandalized whispers. Ellie stood to leave, gathering her boys close. People parted before her like she carried plague. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. She held her head high and walked toward the door with as much dignity as she could summon. Reverend Stone waited by the exit, his smile oily and false. "Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should discuss your situation. I'm certain we could find more appropriate arrangements for you and your children." Before Ellie could respond, a voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "No need, Reverend." Nate Crawford stood in the church doorway blocking the exit. He wore his good suit, the one he clearly hadn't worn in years, based on how it hung slightly loose on his frame. His hair was combed back, his boots polished, but his eyes held something dangerous. The entire congregation went silent. "Mr. Crawford," Stone said smoothly, "how Christian of you to join us. We were just discussing matters of moral propriety." "I heard. Hard not to given you were practically shouting." Nate stepped fully into the church, and Ellie noticed several people unconsciously leaning away from him. He radiated controlled violence, the kind that came from military training and hard experience. "Let me make something very clear to everyone here." He moved to stand beside Ellie, not touching her, but close enough that the statement was unmistakable. Protection. Partnership. Challenge anyone to question it. "Mrs. Morrison is my employee. She teaches ranch children 3 days a week. She lives in the foreman's cabin. I live in the main house. Her sons sleep in her cabin. I sleep in the stable most nights, because being in the house I built for my wife feels like living in a tomb. There is nothing improper, nothing immoral, nothing that requires your concern or your intervention." "Nevertheless," Stone began, the appearance. Nate interrupted, his voice carrying that edge that made people remember he had been a soldier, "is that I offered honest work to a woman in desperate circumstances. The appearance is that I'm doing what every person in this church should have done but didn't. The appearance is that you're manufacturing scandal where none exists." He looked around the congregation, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. "Sarah would have done the same thing for anyone. She was kind like that. And every person in this room knows it. So when you judge Mrs. Morrison for accepting help, when you question whether her children should be taken from her, because I offered employment, you're not just attacking her. You're attacking the memory of the best person most of you ever knew." The silence was absolute. Several people had tears in their eyes. Martha, sitting in the third row, nodded once, approval clear on her face. Stone recovered quickly, his smooth mask sliding back into place. "Of course. I meant no disrespect to Sarah's memory. I'm simply concerned with proper Christian standards." "Then be concerned with your own standards, Reverend, starting with bearing false witness." Nate took Ellie's arm, careful and courteous. "Mrs. Morrison, let's go home." They walked out together, 3 boys following the congregation, parting before them in shocked silence. Outside, the winter sun was blindingly bright against the snow. Ellie's heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. "You didn't have to do that," she said, once they were far enough from the church. "Yes, I did. Why, now they'll talk about us even more." "Let them talk. Words are just wind." He helped her into his wagon, the boys climbing in back. "Besides, Sarah would have done the same, and I'll be damned if I let a corrupt reverend and a vengeful banker destroy you because of it. I made the choice to help." As they rode back toward the ranch, Ellie processed everything that had happened. The sermon, the stairs, Nate's defense. And she realized something that both terrified and comforted her. She had an ally, a real one, someone willing to burn his own reputation to defend hers. The question was what that defense would cost them both before this was over. Christmas Day arrived cold and bright, the kind of morning where the snow reflected sunlight so intensely it hurt to look at directly. Ellie woke to find her boys already up, whispering excitedly about whether there would be any kind of celebration. They had never known a Christmas with presents or plenty. The mining camps had taught them to expect nothing and be grateful for survival. Martha appeared at 9 with an invitation that felt more like a summons. "You're all coming to the main house for Christmas dinner. Nate's orders. Don't argue. Don't refuse. Just get dressed in whatever you've got that's cleanest and be there by noon." Ellie wanted to protest to maintain the careful distance she had been preserving, but she saw the hope in Benjamin's face and couldn't bring herself to crush it. Besides, Martha's expression suggested refusal was not actually an option. The main house was larger than Ellie had realized. 2 stories of solid timber construction with a wide porch and shuttered windows that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical force. A fire roared in a massive stone fireplace, and the smell of roasting meat made her mouth water. Nate stood near the fire, awkward, in clean clothes that looked uncomfortable on him, like he'd forgotten how to wear anything but work shirts and worn denim. Joe sat in a chair by the window, pipe smoke curling around his weathered face. 2 younger men ranch hands Ellie had seen from a distance stood near the table talking in low voices. "Mrs. Morrison," Nate said, nodding to her. "Boys, Merry Christmas." "We don't want to intrude," Ellie began, but Martha cut her off. "You're not intruding. You're part of the ranch now, which makes you part of this. Now sit down before the food gets cold." The meal was unlike anything Ellie and her sons had experienced in years. Turkey potatoes, gravy, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from summer harvest, and a pie that made Benjamin's eyes go round with wonder. They ate with the careful restraint of people who had known hunger, trying not to seem too desperate, even as their bodies screamed for more. Halfway through the meal, Benjamin looked at the empty corner where a Christmas tree should stand and asked the question with the heartbreaking innocence only a 4-year-old possessed. "Mr. Nate, don't you have a tree?" The table went silent. Nate's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Something passed across his face, grief so raw it was painful to witness before he forced it back down into whatever deep place he kept such things. "No, haven't had one in a while." "How come?" "Benjamin, hush," Ellie said quickly, but Nate shook his head. "It's all right." He set down his fork, met the boy's curious gaze. "Last time I had a Christmas tree, my wife Sarah was alive. After she died, it didn't seem right to celebrate without her." Benjamin considered this with the seriousness children bring to matters they don't fully understand but sense are important. Did she like Christmas trees? She loved them, used to make ornaments from whatever she could find, pine cones, ribbon, bits of cloth. Said the tree didn't have to be fancy, it just had to be full of love. Joe cleared his throat roughly and stood his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Well, hell, let's fix that then." Everyone stared at him. Joe didn't do sentiment. Joe was practical gruff, a man who measured the world in work completed and problems solved. The idea of him suggesting anything as frivolous as cutting a Christmas tree seemed as likely as him breaking into song. "You serious?" Nate asked. "You heard the boy? Can't have Christmas dinner without a tree. Sarah wouldn't stand for it." Joe looked at Daniel and Matthew. "You two get your coats. We're going to cut down the finest pine on this ranch." The expedition became something magical despite, or perhaps because of its rough-hewn nature. They trudged through snow that came up to Benjamin's waist, Nate carrying the smallest boy on his shoulders, while Daniel and Matthew raced ahead with Joe, arguing about which tree was best. The ranch hands, Carter brothers named Thomas and William, joined them, and suddenly it was an event, a ritual, something that felt like family, even though they were mostly strangers to each other. They found the tree a quarter-mile from the house, a pine that stood maybe 7 feet tall, full, and straight. Daniel and Matthew insisted it was perfect. Joe and the Carter brothers cut it down while Nate steadied it, and Benjamin cheered from his perch like they had conquered a mountain instead of felled a tree. Getting it back to the house required all of them dragging and pushing it through the snow, laughing. When someone slipped, when the tree caught on a drift, when Thomas made a joke about how they looked like the world's worst military operation. Ellie found herself laughing too real laughter that surprised her with its force. And when she looked up, she caught Nate watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not desire, not calculation, just something soft and wondering, like he was seeing her truly for the first time. Inside, they set the tree in a corner bucket and secured it with stones. Martha appeared from somewhere with a box she claimed to have been saving, and when she opened it, Ellie saw the ornaments Sarah had made. delicate things carefully preserved, each one carrying the ghost of the woman who had shaped it. She'd want them used, Martha said firmly when Nate hesitated. She made them to bring joy, not to gather dust in a box. So they decorated the tree with Sarah's ornaments and with new ones the boys fashioned from whatever they could find. Benjamin made a star from folded paper. Matthew strung together buttons from Martha's sewing kit. Daniel, more reserved, carefully placed each of Sarah's ornaments as if handling something sacred, which in a way he was. When they finished, they stood back and looked at their work. It was imperfect, lopsided, more loved than beautiful, and it was exactly right. Sarah would have liked you, Martha said quietly to Ellie, both of them standing slightly apart from the others. You can't know that. I can. Because you're doing exactly what she would have done, fighting, not for yourself, but for your children, building something from nothing, refusing to break even when the world gives you every reason to. I'm nothing like her. She had Nate's love. She had security. She had a home. She had those things because she chose them, same as you're choosing now. Sarah wasn't born into ease. She was born into hardship, same as most of us. But she decided to build something better, and she chose Nate to build it with. Martha's eyes were sharp. You're standing at the same crossroads she stood at once. Question is whether you've got the courage to choose. Before Ellie could ask what she meant, Nate appeared with small wrapped packages. I didn't know you'd be here, he said, almost apologetic. So these aren't much, but the boys should have something. Daniel received a rope, good quality hemp, perfect for practicing the roping skills he'd been learning. Matthew got a hand-carved horse, detailed and beautiful, that must have taken hours of work. Benjamin's gift was a stuffed dog made from flour sacks, roughly sewn, but soft and huggable. The boys' faces transformed with joy so pure it hurt to witness. They weren't used to receiving gifts, to being thought of, to mattering enough that someone would spend time making something just for them. But we didn't get you nothing, Daniel said, his voice cracking with distress. You're here, Nate said simply. That's enough. Benjamin, with the uninhibited affection of the very young, launched himself at Nate and wrapped small arms around his legs. Thank you, Mr. Nate. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Nate went absolutely still, like a wild animal caught between fight and flight. His hands hovered uncertainly before finally carefully settling on Benjamin's shoulders. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with tears he was fighting not to shed. You're welcome, buddy. The moment stretched tender and fragile, and Ellie felt something shift in her chest. This man who kept everyone at arm's length, who slept in stables to avoid the ghost of his dead wife, who wore his grief like armor, was slowly, painfully letting her children through his defenses. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of warmth and food and the kind of contentment Ellie had forgotten could exist. But as evening approached and shadows lengthened across the snow, a knock at the door shattered the peace. Sheriff William Carter stood on the porch, his hat in his hands and his expression grim. Nate, got a problem. They stepped outside, Ellie following, despite Nate's gesture for her to stay inside. If this concerned her, she would not be protected from it like a child. Carter pulled an official-looking document from his coat. Marcus filed a complaint with the territorial court, says you're housing a woman and children in morally questionable circumstances. Town council called for a hearing. January 15th. They want to examine whether Mrs. Morrison is a fit mother. The words hit like physical blows. Ellie felt her knees go weak, felt the world tilt sickeningly. They wanted to take her children. Marcus wanted to take her children. On what grounds? Nate's voice was deadly quiet. Living in improper arrangements, exposure to moral corruption. The complaint cites Reverend Stone's concerns about the children's welfare. Carter looked genuinely pained. I'm sorry, Nate. I have to serve this. But I'll testify to the truth if it comes to that. You're one of the most decent men I know. How much time do we have? 3 weeks. Hearing scheduled for 2 o'clock on the 15th. After Carter left, Ellie stood frozen on the porch, unable to process what had just happened. 3 weeks until someone in a courtroom decided whether she was fit to keep her own children. 3 weeks until Marcus potentially won everything he'd been after. He can't do this, she whispered. He can't take them from me. He won't, Nate said, but his voice carried uncertainty he was trying to hide. You don't know that. He's rich, respected. I'm a widow with nothing. The law will side with him. Not if you're not a widow. The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Ellie turned to stare at Nate, certain she had misheard. What? Marry me. Before the hearing. If we are married, Marcus has no case. You're respectable. The children have a father. There's nothing improper about a family living together." Ellie's mind went blank, then flooded with too many thoughts at once. Marriage. To a man she barely knew. To save her children from being ripped away. It was insane, practical, desperate, logical, impossible. "You don't love me," she said, the words coming out harsher than intended. "No, I barely know you, but I respect you, and I'll be damned if I let Marcus take those boys because I gave you shelter." Nate's jaw was set in that stubborn line she was learning to recognize. "This solves the problem. You're protected. The children are protected. Marcus loses. What about you? What do you get?" "I get to keep a promise, to help someone when it matters, to not fail again." His voice cracked on the last word. "Please, Ellie, let me do this. And after when the debt's paid and the hearing's done, then what?" "Then we figure it out. Maybe you stay. Maybe you go. Maybe we build something real, or maybe we stay partners in name only. But at least your boys will be safe." Ellie looked through the window at her sons, still admiring their gifts by the firelight. Daniel holding his rope like treasure. Matthew cradling his carved horse. Benjamin hugging his stuffed dog. They deserved security. They deserved a childhood without fear. They deserved a father figure who didn't see them as burdens or bargaining chips. "I need time to think." "You have 3 weeks, but the wedding needs to happen before the hearing for it to mean anything." She nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Nate started to turn away, then stopped. "Ellie, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to stand between your family and the people trying to destroy it. That's all this is." But as she watched him walk back into the house, shoulders straight and head held high, despite the weight he was offering to carry, Ellie wondered if that was true. If marriage, even one born of necessity, rather than love, could ever be just a practical arrangement. If choosing to protect someone day after day wasn't its own kind of love. That night, after the boys were asleep, Ellie sat at the small table in the cabin and tried to think clearly. Marriage to Nate would solve the immediate problem, but it would also tie her to him, create obligations and expectations she might not be able to meet. What if he changed his mind? What if he expected things from her she couldn't give? What if she agreed and then found herself trapped in a new kind of cage? Daniel appeared in the doorway, barefoot and sleepy, but alert, in that way that said he'd been awake worrying. "Mama, are you all right?" "Come here, sweetheart." He patted across the cold floor and climbed into her lap, too big for it really, but she held him anyway, breathing in the little boy smell of him, feeling his heart beat against her chest. "Are they going to take us away?" he asked quietly. "I won't let them. But that man, Uncle Marcus, he wants to. I heard the sheriff talking." Ellie closed her eyes. "Daniel, if I could make things safe for you for Matthew and Benjamin, but it meant doing something big and scary, would you want me to do it?" "Like what?" "Like marrying Mr. Nate, to make us a real family in the eyes of the law, so nobody can say we're living wrong." Daniel was quiet for a long time, processing. "Do you like him, Mr. Nate?" "I trust him. That's more important than liking right now. He's teaching me good things, how to work, how to be useful, how to stand up straight and look people in the eye." Daniel's voice was serious beyond his years. "Papa was good, but he was always worried, always looking for the next thing. Mr. Nate isn't like that. He just stays, does his work, keeps his promises. And you'd be all right if he became your stepfather. I think Papa would want us to be safe, even if it meant having a new Papa." Daniel turned to look at her with eyes far too old. "And Mama, you deserve to stop running, to have a home, even if it's not perfect." Out of the mouths of children, Ellie thought again. Her 9-year-old son had cut through all her complicated fears and reached the simple truth. Safety mattered. Home mattered. And Nate Crawford, for all his ghosts and rough edges, offered both. In town, Marcus Harlan poured whiskey and savored his victory. The hearing was set. Stone had done his part beautifully, poisoning the community against Crawford and his little widow. In 3 weeks, the territorial judge would examine the evidence, hear testimony about improper living arrangements, and rule that the children needed to be removed from such moral corruption. And when Eleanor Morrison had nowhere to go when she was desperate and broken and alone, she would come back to Marcus, because she always would have belonged to him. James had promised. The debt demanded payment, and Marcus always collected what was owed. He didn't know that at that very moment, in a cabin 3 miles away, Eleanor Morrison was making a choice that would unravel every plan he had laid. He didn't know that she was deciding to fight back the only way available to her. He didn't know that by morning she would walk to the main house and tell Nathan Crawford one simple word that would change everything. Yes. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. Ellie made breakfast for her boys, watched them eat, kissed each of their heads with fierce protectiveness. Then she wrapped her shawl tight and walked across the frozen ground to find Nate. He was in the stable as always, brushing down his horse with long, steady strokes. He looked up when she entered, and she saw hope and fear war in his expression. "I'll marry you," she said before she could lose her nerve. "Not for love, not yet, but for partnership, for protection, for giving my boys a chance at something better." Nate set down the brush with careful deliberation. "You're sure?" "No, but I'm choosing it anyway." He crossed the distance between them, stopped just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the silver threading his dark hair, the scars that marked his face from some long-ago violence. "I'll do right by you," he said quietly, "and by them. I swear it." "I know. That's why I'm saying yes." He offered his hand. She took it. They shook on it like business partners because that's what they were, a transaction, an arrangement, a practical solution to an impossible problem. But as Ellie walked back to the cabin, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her fear. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The first green shoot of hope pushing through frozen ground, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The wedding was set for January 14th, one day before the hearing. Judge Harrison Montgomery agreed to officiate at the ranch, citing the impracticality of a church ceremony given the circumstances and Reverend Stone's obvious bias. The gathering would be small, just the ranch families, Joe, Martha, Sheriff Carter, and the three boys who would gain a father, whether they fully understood what that meant or not. But Marcus Harland was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. On the morning of January 10th, 4 days before the wedding, one of Marcus's clerks arrived at the Clearwater Sheriff's office with information that would change everything. Emily Watson was 23, plain-faced and sharp-minded, the kind of woman people overlooked, which made her dangerously observant. She had worked at Harland Bank for 2 years, keeping records and pretending not to hear the conversations that happened behind closed doors. But 3 days ago she had heard something that made her blood run cold. "Sheriff Carter," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched a ledger to her chest like armor, "I need to report a crime." Carter looked up from his paperwork, saw the fear in her eyes, and gestured for her to sit. "What kind of crime?" "Conspiracy to commit arson and possibly murder." The words came out in a rush. "Mr. Harland and Reverend Stone. I heard them planning to burn down Red Mesa Ranch the night before Mr. Crawford's wedding." She told him everything. The conversation she'd overheard about destroying the barn, about making it look like an accident, about ensuring that Nate Crawford would have nothing left to support a family when the hearing came, and the money, $8,000 promised to Stone for his cooperation. Carter's face went hard as granite. "You willing to testify to this? I'll lose my position, maybe worse, but I can't let them hurt good people." Emily met his eyes. "My mother died in a fire when I was young. I won't stand by and let someone else's family burn." Carter reached for his gun belt. "You stay here. I'm getting Judge Montgomery." But before he could act, news came that would make Emily's testimony temporarily irrelevant. Because Marcus Harland, desperate and furious that his plans were unraveling, decided to move his timeline up. On the night of January 13th, the night before the wedding, Daniel Morrison couldn't sleep. Excitement and anxiety warred in his chest. Tomorrow his mother would marry. Mr. Nate would become Mrs. Crawford, would make them a real family in the eyes of the law. Tomorrow they would be safe from Uncle Marcus and his schemes. Tomorrow everything would change. He lay in bed listening to Matthew's steady breathing and Benjamin's soft snores and tried to imagine what it would be like to have a father again. Not Papa, nobody could replace Papa, but someone who would stay, who would teach him to be a man, who would stand between them and the world's cruelty. A flicker of orange light caught his eye through the window. At first he thought it was lamplight from the barn, someone doing late chores, but the color was wrong, too bright, too wild. And then he smelled it. Smoke sharp and acrid carried on the wind. "Mama!" Daniel bolted from bed. "Mama, fire!" The barn was already fully engulfed by the time they reached the door. Flames climbed the walls like living things, hungry and furious, devouring dry timber and hay with terrifying speed. The horses inside screamed high-pitched shrieks of animal terror that cut through the night like knives. Nate burst from the stable, wearing only his nightshirt and boots, his face stark with horror. He didn't hesitate, didn't stop to assess the danger. He ran straight into the burning building. "Nate, no!" Ellie's scream tore through the chaos, but he was already gone, swallowed by smoke and flame. Joe appeared from the main house, the Carter brothers right behind him, all of them running with buckets, blankets, anything that might fight the fire. But it was already too late for the barn. All they could do was prevent the flames from spreading to other buildings. Inside the inferno, Nate moved by instinct and memory. He knew this barn like he knew his own hands had built it himself 10 years ago. He found the stalls by touch. Through the blinding smoke, through open gates, drove horses toward the door, one by one. They fought him, crazed with fear, but he was stronger, more desperate. The last horse was his own mount, the bay gelding Sarah had given him as a wedding present 15 years ago. The animal stood in its stall, trembling, too terrified to run even with the gate open. Nate grabbed its halter, pulled with all his strength. That's when the beam fell. 20 feet of burning timber crashed down across Nate's leg, pinning him to the ground. The pain was immediate and absolute white-hot agony that drove coherent thought from his mind. He could see the exit, could see the rectangle of night sky and safety just 30 feet away. Might as well have been 30 miles. The horse finally bolted, leaving Nate alone in the burning building with smoke filling his lungs and flames eating closer every second. Outside, Ellie saw the horse emerge without Nate and understood immediately what had happened. She started running toward the barn entrance before conscious thought caught up with instinct. "Ellie, don't!" Joe grabbed for her, but she twisted away. "He's trapped. He's dying in there. You go in there, you'll die too. Then we die." She shook off his hands. "I won't let him burn alone like Sarah did." The words froze Joe in place, shocked him into releasing his grip. Ellie didn't wait for him to recover. She wrapped a wet blanket around herself, pulled it over her head, and ran into hell. The heat was unimaginable, like standing next to the sun. Smoke choked her, burned her eyes, turned the world into a nightmare of orange and black. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, couldn't breathe without her lungs screaming in protest. "Nate!" Her voice came out as a rasp. "Nate! Here." So faint she almost missed it. "Ellie, get out! Leave me!" She followed his voice, stumbling over debris, feeling her way through smoke, found him pinned beneath the beam, his face gray with shock and pain, his leg twisted at an angle that made her stomach turn. "I can't lift it alone," she said, coughing. "You have to help." "Can't. Too heavy." "Yes, you can. You're going to help me because those 3 boys out there need you, because I need you, because you promised to keep us safe, and you can't do that if you're dead." Something flickered in his eyes. Will, maybe. Or just stubborn refusal to let Marcus Harland win. He nodded once. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They lifted together Ellie, pouring every ounce of strength into raising the beam just enough for Nate to drag himself free. His leg scraped against the floor, leaving a dark smear of blood. He gasped in agony, but kept moving. Then they were stumbling toward the exit, Nate's arm around Ellie's shoulders, her arm around his waist, both of them coughing and choking and staying upright through sheer desperation. The barn groaned around them, structural supports, failing the entire building moments from collapse. They fell through the doorway. Just as the roof caved in behind them, a wave of heat and sparks and destruction chasing them into the snow. Joe and the Carter brothers pulled them away from the burning wreckage, patted out the places where Ellie's dress had caught fire, where Nate's hair was singed. When Ellie could breathe again, when her vision cleared enough to see, she found 3 boys standing in a cluster, holding each other, their faces streaked with tears and soot. Daniel's expression was pure terror giving way to relief. Matthew was sobbing openly. Benjamin had his thumb in his mouth, something he hadn't done in months. "You're alive," Daniel whispered. "I thought you were both dead." Ellie pulled them to her, held them so tight they protested. "We're all right, we're all right." But they weren't all right. The barn was destroyed, 3 horses dead, all their winter feed turned to ash. Ranch hands stood in shocked silence, watching their livelihood burn. And Nate lay in the snow with a broken leg, his face twisted in pain, his dream of a simple wedding ceremony now replaced by the nightmare of explaining this disaster to a judge in less than 24 hours. Sheriff Carter arrived at first light, having ridden through the night after hearing about the fire. He found Marcus Harland riding up to survey the damage, his face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Tragic," Marcus said, dismounting. "Absolutely tragic. How will Crawford manage, now I hear the wedding was supposed to be today?" "Funny thing," Carter said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Fire started in 3 places simultaneously, almost like someone set it deliberately." "Are you accusing me, Sheriff?" "Not yet, but I will be. Got a witness says you planned this, says you and Reverend Stone conspired to burn this barn to destroy Crawford's ability to support a family, to force Mrs. Morrison back into your control." Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, fury and fear flickering across his features. "That's a lie. Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is I'm watching you now, every move, and if I find one shred of evidence connecting you to this fire, I'll see you hang." Marcus recovered his composure, smiled that oily smile that made good people want to wash their hands. "Of course, Sheriff. I'm happy to cooperate with any investigation. But I think you'll find I was home all evening. Multiple witnesses can confirm it." He rode away before Carter could respond, leaving the sheriff staring at the smoking ruins and wondering how rich men always managed to keep their hands clean while other people burned. Inside the main house, Ellie tended Nate's leg while Martha boiled water for bandages. The break was bad bone pressing against skin swelling, already turning his leg purple and black. He needed a doctor, but the nearest one was in Clearwater, 7 miles away, over roads made treacherous by snow. "We have to postpone," Nate said through gritted teeth. "Can't get married like this. Can't even stand." "Then we don't stand." Ellie's voice was firm, decided. "Judge Montgomery can marry us right here in this room with you in a chair. We're not giving Marcus the satisfaction of winning. Ellie, be reasonable. Look at this place. Look at me. I'm broken. The ranch is broken. You can't tie yourself to this disaster." "I'm not tying myself to disaster. I'm choosing to stand with a man who ran into fire to save his horses, who broke his leg protecting what he loves, who tried to send me away to keep me safe." She knelt beside his chair, took his hand carefully. "You think I don't see what you did? You stayed in that barn after the horses were out. You were checking for anything else alive, any animal that might be trapped. That's who you are. And that's who I want beside me when we face Marcus in court. The judge will see this as proof I can't provide for a family. The judge will see this as proof that someone is desperate enough to commit arson to stop us. That makes our case stronger, not weaker." Joe spoke up from the doorway. "She's right, boss. This fire proves Marcus is dangerous, proves he'll stop at nothing. Judge needs to see that." Nate looked around the room at the faces watching him, Joe steady and loyal as ever, Martha fierce and protective, the Carter brothers angry on his behalf, Ellie determined and unafraid despite everything, and the 3 boys huddled together in the corner, watching to see if the only father figure they had left would give up. "All right," he said finally, "we do it today. Here, exactly as planned." By noon, they had transformed the damaged ranch into something that resembled a wedding venue. Not beautiful, not traditional, but real, honest, built from ashes and stubbornness. Judge Montgomery arrived with his official robes and his surprised expression. He had expected a delay, a cancellation, anything, but finding the wedding proceeding as if disaster hadn't just struck. 30 people gathered in the main house, ranch families pressed together, children wide-eyed and solemn. Joe and Martha standing as witnesses, Sheriff Carter positioned near the door watching for any sign of Marcus, and Nate sitting in a straight-backed chair with his broken leg propped on a stool, wearing the same suit from Christmas, his face pale but resolute. Ellie wore a simple dress Martha had altered to fit her dark blue because white seemed presumptuous for a second marriage built on necessity. She held a small bundle of winter berries Martha had gathered, the only flowers available in January. The judge began the ceremony with the traditional words, but when he reached the vows, Nate stopped him. "Judge, I'd like to say something first." Montgomery nodded, curious. Nate looked at Ellie, really looked at her, seeing past the practical arrangement to the woman who had run into fire for him, who had refused to let him die alone, who was choosing him, despite having every reason not to. "Ellie, I'm not going to lie and say I love you. I barely know you. We've shared 3 weeks of each other's lives, most of it dealing with other people's hate and violence. That's not enough time to build the kind of love poets write about." The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was not how wedding vows were supposed to go. But I will say this. I promise to protect you and your boys with everything I have. I promise to work every day to earn the trust you're placing in me. I promise to never make you feel like a burden or an obligation. I promise to be here present, not chasing money in Montana or glory in some far-off place. Here, with you, building something real. His voice roughened with emotion. I couldn't promise that to Sarah, and she died waiting for me, but I can promise it to you. And I will spend every day proving that this broken, burned-out ranch, this damaged man with a shattered leg, is still worth the risk you're taking. Silence filled the room. Several people were crying openly now. I take you, Eleanor Morrison, as my wife, my partner, and my choice. And I will be faithful to that choice every day for as long as I live. Ellie's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. She took a breath, steadied herself, and spoke words she had not planned, but that came from some deep place of truth. Nathan, I can't promise love either, not yet. I trusted my first husband completely, and when he died he left me with nothing but debt and danger and 3 boys to raise alone. That taught me to be careful with trust. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I can promise this. I will work beside you, not behind you. I will teach your ranch children and help build your home and raise my boys to be men like you. Men who run into fire to save what they love. Men who keep their promises even when it costs them everything. Her voice strengthened. I will not take your sacrifice for granted. I will not treat this marriage as charity or rescue. I will be your partner in every way that matters. And I will choose you, Nathan Crawford, every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She looked at the assembled witnesses. This isn't a fairy tale. We're 2 broken people trying to build something whole, but maybe that's the truest kind of marriage there is. Judge Montgomery cleared his throat, visibly moved. Then, by the power vested in me by Wyoming territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Nathan, you may kiss your bride. Nate stood with difficulty, balancing on his good leg. Ellie met him halfway. Their kiss was gentle, careful, more promise than passion. But it was real. And in that room full of people who had witnessed their struggle, who had fought the fire beside them, who had chosen to show up despite the scandal and the danger, it was enough. The celebration was brief. Bread and cheese, weak coffee, a few toasts. Nothing fancy, because they had nothing left to be fancy with. But it was joyful in its own rough way. The joy of people who had survived when they weren't supposed to, who had built something good from materials that should have produced nothing but disaster. As the sun began to set, Sheriff Carter took Nate aside. The hearing's tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Can you travel? I'll crawl there if I have to. Marcus is going to use this fire as evidence you can't provide for a family. He'll paint you as reckless as a man who can't protect what's his. Then we tell them the truth, that he set the fire, that he's the danger, not me. Emily's testimony helps, but Marcus has money for good lawyers. This could go either way. Carter's expression was grim. You need to be prepared for them to take the boys. They're not taking those boys. Nate's voice was absolute certainty. I don't care what I have to do or say or promise. Those children are staying with their mother, with us. That's final. Carter nodded slowly. Then you better rest up. Tomorrow's going to be the fight of your life. That night, Ellie sat beside Nate's bed in the main house where Martha had insisted he stay for easier care. The boys were asleep in their cabin watched over by Joe. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional shift of surviving horses in the makeshift shelter. Are you afraid? Nate asked quietly. About tomorrow? Terrified, but I've been terrified for 8 months. I'm used to it. If they take the boys, if the judge rules against us, I want you to know I'll fight it. I'll appeal. I'll use every resource I have. I know. Ellie looked at him, this man who was now legally her husband, but still felt like a stranger in so many ways. Why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's about Sarah or redemption. What's the real reason? Nate was quiet for a long time. When Sarah died, something in me died too. I stopped believing good things could happen. Stopped believing I deserved them. Spent 5 years just existing, working, going through motions. He met her eyes. Then I saw you on your knees in the snow with 3 boys behind you, and something woke up that I thought was dead forever. Not love, but the capacity for love. The possibility that maybe I could build something again, be something again, matter to someone again. And if we lose tomorrow, if they take Daniel and Matthew and Benjamin, then we lost fighting, together. And that's better than dying alone in a burning barn, which is what I've been doing for 5 years." He reached for her hand. "Thank you, Ellie, for running into the fire, for not letting me give up, for being brave when I couldn't be." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the tremor of pain he was trying to hide. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we face Marcus, and we win." "How can you be so certain?" "Because we have to be, because those boys deserve better, because you and I were survivors, and survivors don't quit." In town, Marcus Harland stared at the marriage certificate that had been filed that afternoon and felt rage so pure it was almost clarifying. Crawford had married her, had actually gone through with it despite the fire, despite the broken leg, despite everything. But Marcus wasn't finished, not yet. Tomorrow in court, he would present his case. The forged letter from James, the evidence of instability, the fire proving Crawford's inability to protect a family. And when the judge ruled in his favor, when Eleanor's boys were taken into custody, pending proper placement, she would have nowhere to turn except back to him. And this time, he would make sure she understood exactly what debt meant, exactly what belonging to Marcus Harland would cost her, exactly how thoroughly he could destroy anyone who tried to deny him what was rightfully his. Tomorrow would be a reckoning, for Crawford, for Eleanor, for everyone who had dared to stand against him. He poured another whiskey and smiled into the darkness, certain of his victory, blind to the forces already gathering against him, deaf to the approach of the justice he had spent so long avoiding. Tomorrow would indeed be a reckoning, but not the one Marcus Harland expected. The morning of January 15th arrived gray and bitter, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made every movement feel like pushing through water. Nate woke before dawn in the main house bed where Martha had insisted he stay, his broken leg throbbing with a pain that no amount of laudanum could fully suppress. Today they would stand before Judge Montgomery, and the assembled citizens of Clearwater and Marcus Harland would try one final time to take everything that mattered. Ellie appeared in the doorway carrying his good suit freshly brushed and pressed. Her face was pale with exhaustion and fear, but her hands were steady as she laid the clothes across the chair. "So, how's the leg?" "Hurts like hell, but I can manage." He pushed himself upright, gritting his teeth against the spike of agony. "How are the boys?" "Scared. Daniel hasn't slept. He's been sitting at the window all night watching for something, but he won't tell me what." Her voice cracked slightly. "Nate, what if we lose? What if the judge decides Marcus is right, that I'm unfit, that they'd be better off somewhere else?" He reached for her hand, pulled her down to sit beside him on the bed. "Then we appeal. We fight. We do whatever it takes. But Ellie, look at me. We're not going to lose. That fire proved Marcus is desperate and dangerous. Emily's testimony will show conspiracy. And we're married now, respectable and legal. The judge has no grounds to take those boys. Marcus has money for good lawyers. He'll twist everything. Make the fire look like your negligence instead of his crime. Make me look like an opportunist who trapped you into marriage." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I've seen how the law works for rich men. It bends in their favor. Not this time. Not with Judge Montgomery. That man's reputation is built on fairness, not favoritism." Nate squeezed her hand. "Trust me. Trust us. We've come too far to quit now." In the cabin across the yard, Daniel sat by the window with something clutched tight in his fist. He'd been holding it for 8 months. This piece of paper his father had pressed into his hand 3 days before the mining accident. The last thing James Morrison had ever given his eldest son. "If something happens to me," his father had whispered, fever-bright eyes intense, "don't show this to anyone unless you absolutely have to. Not your mama, not anyone. But if Marcus ever tries to take you away from her, if he ever uses my name to claim you belong with him, then you give this to a judge. You understand, Danny? To a judge, not to Marcus." Daniel had understood, though he'd hoped desperately he would never need to. He'd carried the letter through their mother's grief, through the long journey to Clearwater, through that terrible night when Marcus slapped Mama in the snow. He'd kept it hidden even when Sheriff Carter served the hearing notice, even when Nate proposed marriage, even through the fire and the wedding. But today he would use it. Today he would do what his real father had asked him to do, even if it meant standing up in a courtroom full of adults and calling a powerful man a liar. The wagon ride to town was torture for Nate, every bump and rut sending fresh waves of pain through his broken leg. Joe drove with careful precision, trying to minimize the jostling, but there was only so much that could be done on roads still frozen from winter storms. Ellie sat beside Nate in the wagon bed, one hand holding his, the other arm around Benjamin, who had refused to be left behind. Daniel and Matthew rode up front with Joe, both boys silent and tense. Daniel's hand stayed in his pocket fingers, wrapped around the letter that would either save them or mean nothing at all. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread through Clearwater about the hearing, and it seemed half the town had turned out to watch. Some faces were sympathetic people who knew Nate's reputation for fairness and hard work. Others looked eager for scandal, hungry for the spectacle of a respected rancher being brought low. And in the front row, wearing an expensive suit and a confident smile, sat Marcus Harland. Reverend Stone sat beside him, his pale eyes gleaming with righteous certainty. The two men had the look of hunters who had cornered their prey and were simply waiting for the kill shot. Judge Harrison Montgomery took his seat at the bench, his weathered face grave and unreadable. He was 62 years old, a man who had served Wyoming Territory for 20 years, with a reputation for iron integrity. If anyone could see through Marcus's schemes, it would be him. This hearing concerns the matter of child welfare. Montgomery began, his voice carrying through the crowded room. Specifically, whether Eleanor Crawford, formerly Morrison, is a fit mother, and whether her current living circumstances serve the best interests of her 3 minor sons. Mr. Harland, as the plaintiff, you may present your case. Marcus stood smoothing his vest with the practiced gesture of a man used to being the most important person in any room. He had hired a lawyer from Cheyenne, a sharp-faced man named Garrett, who specialized in making uncomfortable truths sound like moral imperatives. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about what's best for 3 innocent children who have already suffered the loss of their father. Garrett's voice was smooth as oil. My client, Marcus Harland, is the brother of the deceased James Morrison. Before his untimely death, Mr. Morrison made clear his wishes regarding the care of his family, should anything happen to him. He produced a document, held it up for the court to see. This letter, written in James Morrison's own hand and properly witnessed, explicitly states that in the event of his death, his wife and children should be placed under Marcus Harland's care and protection. Ellie's hand tightened on Nate's until her nails dug into his palm. This was it, the forged letter Marcus had mentioned, the lie that would tear their family apart unless someone could prove it false. Furthermore, Garrett continued, warming to his theme. The circumstances under which Mrs. Morrison, now Mrs. Crawford, came to be living on Nathan Crawford's property raised serious questions about judgment and propriety. She arrived in Clearwater penniless and desperate, moved directly onto an unmarried man's ranch, and lived there for weeks before entering into what can only be described as a marriage of convenience. That marriage is legal and binding, Judge Montgomery interrupted. Whatever motivated it, the law recognizes it as valid. Indeed, Your Honor. But consider the timing. This marriage took place literally hours before this hearing, almost as if it were specifically designed to circumvent legitimate concerns about the children's welfare. Garrett turned to face the courtroom. And then there's the matter of the fire. 3 nights ago, Red Mesa Ranch suffered a catastrophic barn fire that destroyed valuable property and killed livestock. Mr. Crawford claims this was arson, but where is the proof? Could it not simply have been negligence? A man too distracted by his new domestic situation to properly maintain his property. That's a lie. Nate started to rise, but Ellie pulled him back down. Losing his temper would only help Marcus's case. The sheriff is investigating the fire, Montgomery said calmly. That matter is separate from this hearing. Let's stay focused on the children's welfare. Of course, Your Honor, the point is simply, this Nathan Crawford, whatever his intentions, is not equipped to provide a stable home for these children. His ranch is damaged, his finances strained by rebuilding costs, and he entered into this marriage not from love, but from a misguided sense of obligation. Garrett placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus Harland, by contrast, is financially stable, has deep roots in this community, and has a blood connection to these children. He is, by any objective measure, the better guardian. Sheriff Carter stood from his seat in the back. Your Honor, I have testimony that contradicts several of Mr. Garrett's claims. You'll get your chance, Sheriff. Mr. Harland, is there anything else you wish to present? Marcus stood playing the grieving brother with practiced ease. Only this, Your Honor. My brother James was a good man who made poor choices. He died trying to provide for his family, and I respect that. But Eleanor has always been impulsive, prone to decisions based on emotion rather than logic. James worried about that. It's why he wrote that letter, why he wanted me to have legal authority over the children's welfare. He knew that if something happened to him, Eleanor would need guidance structure, someone to ensure those boys grew up properly. It was a masterful performance, concerned masking control, family loyalty, hiding possessiveness, and it was clearly affecting the judge, whose expression had shifted from neutral to thoughtful. Mrs. Crawford, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Ellie stood slowly, her voice stronger than Nate had expected. Your Honor, Marcus Harland is a liar. That letter he's shown you is a forgery. My husband James died afraid of his brother, afraid of what would happen to us if Marcus got control. He never wrote those words. He never wanted Marcus anywhere near his children. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Crawford. Do you have proof? I have 8 months of watching Marcus try to force me into servitude. I have the bruise on my face from where he struck me when I refused to work for him without wages. I have Nathan Crawford's testimony that he paid $300 to free me from a debt Marcus was using as leverage. Her voice shook but didn't break. And I have the knowledge that 3 nights ago someone set fire to our barn to prevent this marriage from happening. Who benefits from that, Your Honor? Who wants to destroy our family badly enough to commit arson? Sheriff Carter, you mentioned testimony. Carter stood again. Yes, Your Honor. I have a witness who overheard Marcus Harland and Reverend Stone planning the barn fire. A Miss Emily Watson, clerk at Harland Bank, will testify that she heard Mr. Harland offer Reverend Stone $8,000 to help burn down Red Mesa Ranch. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Marcus's face went white, then red with fury. Stone stood abruptly, looking like he wanted to bolt for the door, but Carter's hand on his shoulder kept him seated. That's absurd, Marcus shouted. The word of a disgruntled employee against mine? This is a transparent attempt to discredit me. We'll hear Miss Watson's testimony, Montgomery said firmly. Bring her in. Emily Watson entered the courtroom looking terrified but determined. She was shaking so hard the bailiff had to steady her arm as she took the witness stand. But when she spoke, her voice was clear. I heard them planning it. Mr. Harland and Reverend Stone in Mr. Harland's office 3 days before the fire. They said they would burn the barn to make Mr. Crawford look negligent, to ruin his ability to support a family. Mr. Harland promised $8,000 for Stone's help. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Garrett demanded. Because I was afraid. Mr. Harland is the most powerful man in town. He could destroy my reputation, my employment, my future. But I couldn't let him hurt those children. My own mother died in a fire. I know what it's like to lose family to flames. I won't stand by and let someone deliberately set a fire that could have killed people. Her testimony was damning, specific, detailed, the kind of evidence that turned speculation into certainty. Montgomery made notes, his expression darkening with each word. Mr. Harland, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Marcus stood struggling to maintain his composure. Your Honor, this is clearly a coordinated attack on my character. First, Mrs. Crawford accuses me of forgery. Now a disgruntled employee claims I planned arson. These are desperate lies from desperate people. Then let's address the forgery claim. You presented a letter you claim was written by James Morrison. Mrs. Crawford claims it's fake. How do we determine the truth? I have a handwriting expert standing by, Garrett said quickly. He can verify the letter's authenticity. I'm sure you do, Montgomery said dryly. However, I'd prefer an independent expert. Sheriff, can you arrange that? Already have, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison from the Territorial Records Office. He's examined samples of James Morrison's handwriting from bank documents and contracts. He can compare them to the letter in question. The expert was called, spent 20 minutes examining Marcus's letter under a magnifying glass, comparing it to verified samples of James's writing. Finally, he looked up. This letter is skillfully done, but it's a forgery. The pressure points are wrong, the letter formation slightly off. Someone copied James Morrison's handwriting, but they weren't James Morrison. The courtroom exploded. Marcus lunged forward, face twisted with rage. That's impossible. This is a conspiracy. You're all working together to rob me of what's rightfully mine. What's rightfully yours, Montgomery's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Children are not property, Mr. Harland. They are human beings deserving of safety and love, and from everything I've heard today, you're interested in neither. That's when Daniel stood up. The 9-year-old boy rose from his seat beside his mother with the slow deliberation of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Every eye in the courtroom turned to him. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice clear despite his youth, "I have something to show you." "Daniel, sit down," Ellie whispered urgently, but he shook his head. "Young man, this is not appropriate," Garrett began, but Montgomery raised his hand. "Let the boy speak. These proceedings concern his future. He has a right to be heard." Daniel walked to the front of the courtroom, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft from being carried for months. "This is a letter my papa gave me 3 days before he died. He told me to keep it secret unless Uncle Marcus ever tried to use Papa's name to take us away from Mama. He said if that happened, I should give this to a judge." He handed the letter to Montgomery with hands that trembled only slightly. The judge unfolded it, began to read, and his expression transformed from interest to anger. "This is addressed to territorial authorities," Montgomery said slowly, "dated 3 days before James Morrison's death. Would you like me to read it aloud?" "Please, Your Honor," Daniel said. Montgomery's voice filled the courtroom. "To any officer of Wyoming Territory who may read this. I am James Morrison, currently residing at the Lucky Strike Mine in Montana. I am writing this in sound mind but failing health, fearing I may not survive the consumption that plagues me. If I die, and my brother Marcus Harland attempts to claim guardianship of my wife Eleanor and my sons Daniel, Matthew, and Benjamin, please know this, I do not want him anywhere near my family. Marcus loaned me $300 with the understanding that if I could not repay it, Eleanor would work for him as unpaid labor. He called it household service, but we both knew what he truly meant. She would be his property in all but name." The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. "I am ashamed to say I agreed to these terms in desperation, but I have come to understand that I made a deal with a man who has no conscience, no mercy, no decency. If I die owing him money, he will use that debt to enslave my wife. He will take my sons and raise them to be like him, cruel and grasping. Please, whoever reads this, do not let him have them. Send them to my wife's family in Pennsylvania, if possible. Send them to strangers, if necessary. But do not under any circumstances give them to Marcus Harland. He is my brother, and I love him, but I do not trust him with the lives of those I love more." Montgomery set the letter down carefully. "This letter is notarized by the Territorial Recorder's Office in Helena, Montana. The signature is verified. The date is confirmed. This is James Morrison's true final testimony." Marcus stood frozen, all his careful planning destroyed by a letter his brother had written as insurance against exactly this scenario. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Furthermore," Montgomery continued, his voice heavy with disgust, "this letter makes clear that Mr. Harland attempted to coerce Mrs. Morrison into servitude using fabricated debt as leverage. That is illegal in Wyoming Territory. Sheriff Carter, I believe you have grounds for arrest." "Wait." Marcus finally found his voice. "You can't do this. I'm a respected businessman. I have rights." "You have the right to a trial which you'll receive, but you will await that trial in custody." Montgomery turned to the courtroom. "I've heard enough. The testimony is clear. Marcus Harland has no legal or moral claim to these children. His letter is proven false. His conspiracy to commit arson is substantiated by witness testimony. And his attempt to manipulate the courts to serve his personal vendetta is an offense against justice itself." He looked at Nate and Ellie. "Mrs. Crawford is demonstrably fit to parent her children. Her marriage to Nathan Crawford, whatever its origins appears to be, entered into voluntarily and maintained with genuine partnership. The children are clean, healthy, and clearly loved. I see no grounds whatsoever to remove them from their mother's care." The gavel came down. Case dismissed. The children remain with Eleanor and Nathan Crawford. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the courtroom erupted in applause. Ranch families who had traveled to support Nate stood cheering. Joe let out a whoop that echoed off the rafters. Martha was crying openly, something Nate had only seen her do once before. Marcus made one final desperate move. He lunged toward Ellie, hands reaching for her throat, face twisted with rage. "You bitch! You owe me! James promised you to me!" Nate moved faster than should have been possible for a man with a broken leg. He pushed himself up from his chair, balanced on his good leg, and swung. His fist connected with Marcus's jaw with all the force of months of suppressed fury. Marcus went down hard, sprawling across the courtroom floor. "You're done," Nate said quietly, standing over him. You threatened my wife. You tried to kill my family. You're done." Sheriff Carter moved in with handcuffs, hauling Marcus to his feet. Reverend Stone tried to slip out the side door but found his path blocked by 3 angry ranch hands who had no intention of letting him escape. That's when Benjamin broke free from his mother's grip. The 4-year-old ran across the courtroom, arms outstretched, and launched himself at Nate. "Papa!" The word rang through the suddenly silent courthouse. Nate caught him instinctively, nearly losing his balance, and Benjamin wrapped small arms around his neck with desperate strength. "Papa, Papa, you saved us!" Matthew was right behind him, crashing into Nate's legs, nearly toppling him. "Papa, you hit the bad man!" And then Daniel, trying to maintain his dignity, as the oldest but failing completely, joined his brothers in a tangle of arms and tears and joy. "Papa, thank you for fighting for us." Nate stood there supported by the chair Joe had shoved behind him, surrounded by 3 boys calling him Papa, and something inside him that had been frozen since Sarah died finally completely thawed. He was crying openly now, not caring who saw. One arm around Benjamin, one hand on Daniel's shoulder. Matthew pressed against his side. "I've got you," he whispered, voice breaking. "I've got all of you, always, I promise." The entire courtroom was in tears. Hardened cowboys wiping their eyes, women sobbing into handkerchiefs. Even Judge Montgomery had to pause and clear his throat before speaking. "Sheriff, remove the prisoners. This hearing is concluded." As Carter led Marcus and Stone out in chains, Marcus twisted back for one final venomous look. "This isn't over, Crawford. I'll appeal. I'll fight this. I'll destroy you." "No, Marcus, it's over. You lost." Nate pulled his sons closer. "And we won. All of us." Outside the courthouse, the winter sun broke through clouds for the first time in days. Ellie stood on the steps watching her husband surrounded by their boys and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the sensation. Peace. Not just relief or temporary safety, but deep bone-level peace. The knowledge that they were home, that they were family, that they had fought together and won. Joe appeared beside her, offered his arm. "Your husband just became a legend. Everyone in that courtroom saw what just happened. Man with a broken leg stands up to defend his family, punches the town banker, and gets his boys calling him Papa in front of God and everybody. That's the kind of story people tell their grandchildren. He earned it. Every bit of it." Ellie watched Nate trying to hobble toward the wagon while 3 boys clung to him and laughed through her tears. "He's going to fall if they don't let him go." "He won't let go even if he does fall. Those boys are his now, same as if he'd been there the day they were born." Joe's voice went soft. "Sarah would have loved this, would have loved them, would have loved you for bringing Nate back to life." "You think so?" "I know so, because she told me once, right before she died, that if anything happened to her, she hoped Nate would find someone who'd fight for him the way he fought for everyone else. She'd have picked you, Ellie. She'd have picked you and those boys, and she'd have been grateful you were all stubborn enough to save each other." They walked down the steps together to join the celebration that was already forming. Ranch hands clapping Nate on the back, Martha organizing an impromptu gathering at the general store, Daniel showing everyone his father's letter with fierce pride, Matthew and Benjamin reenacting Nate punching Marcus with increasingly dramatic flourishes. Sheriff Carter appeared one more time before they left town. "Wanted you to know, Crawford. Marcus will get 20 years, minimum probably more, conspiracy to arson, attempted assault, fraud, and Stone's going down with him. Emily's testimony is ironclad. They're done. Thank you, Bill, for believing us, for fighting for what's right. That's the job, or it should be anyway." Carter tipped his hat to Ellie. "Ma'am, you've got yourself a good man there. Treat him right. I plan to, for the rest of my life." The ride back to Red Mesa Ranch was triumphant, despite Nate's pain and exhaustion. They sang songs the boys knew from before their father died, songs James had taught them that Nate learned as they went. They stopped twice because Nate's leg needed rest, but nobody minded. They had won. They had time now. Time to heal, time to grow, time to build the life they'd fought so hard to protect. As the sun set and the ranch came into view, Nate looked at his family, his wife sitting beside him, her hand in his. His 3 sons in the wagon bed already asleep from emotional exhaustion. Daniel's arm around Matthew Benjamin curled against them both. His home damaged but still standing, waiting for them to rebuild it better than before. "You all right?" Ellie asked quietly. "Better than all right? I'm happy, actually completely happy. Haven't felt that in 15 years. Get used to it. We're going to give you a lot more reasons to be happy." That night, after the boys were in bed and the ranch was quiet, Nate and Ellie sat together in the main house. His leg was propped up, laudanum finally dulling the worst of the pain. She sat beside him, her head on his shoulder, both of them too exhausted to move but too content to sleep. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For stopping that night in the snow, for paying Marcus, for running into fire, for standing in that courtroom on a broken leg and fighting for us, for being exactly what we needed when we needed it most. You did the same for me. You ran into that barn when you could have let me burn. You stood beside me when the whole town said you shouldn't. You chose me, Ellie. You chose us. That's the bravest thing anyone's ever done." They sat in silence for a while, watching firelight play across the walls, listening to the house settle around them. "We should probably talk about the future," Ellie said eventually. "About what comes next, about whether this marriage stays practical or becomes something more." "It's already something more, has been for weeks, maybe months. I just didn't want to admit it, because admitting it meant risking it." Nate turned to look at her. "I love you, Ellie Crawford, not because you need me or because I need you, but because you're funny and fierce and stronger than anyone I've ever met. Because you make me want to be better. Because when I think about the future, you're in every single moment of it. I love you too. Have for longer than I wanted to admit. Was scared you'd think I was just grateful or practical or trying to secure my position, but it's none of those things. It's just love. The real kind. The kind that grows from trust and partnership and choosing each other every single day." They kissed, long and slow and full of promise. Outside Wyoming, winter held the world in its grip. But inside in the house they would fill with laughter and arguments, and the 1,000 small moments that made a life spring had already come. Tomorrow they would start rebuilding the barn. Tomorrow the ranch hands would return to work. Tomorrow life would resume its normal rhythms. But tonight they were simply two people who had found each other in impossible circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. 3 boys slept safely in their beds, calling Nate Papa in their dreams. And somewhere in the darkness, the ghost of Sarah Crawford smiled, released at last from the guilt that had held her husband captive, grateful that he had finally found his way home. October 15th, 1883. The evening came soft and golden autumn, painting the Wyoming plains in shades of amber and rust. Inside the main house at Red Mesa Ranch, Ellie Crawford labored to bring new life into a world that had tried so hard to break her. Nate refused to leave. Martha had tried to push him out, citing propriety and the traditional separation of men from the bloody business of birth, but he planted himself in a chair beside the bed and would not be moved. "I wasn't there for Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that edge of steel that meant the discussion was over. "I won't make that mistake twice." The labor was long. Hours stretched into more hours, punctuated by Ellie's gasps and Martha's calm instructions and the doctor's occasional grunts of approval. Nate held Ellie's hand through it all, letting her squeeze until his bones ground together, whispering encouragement that probably made no sense, but seemed to help anyway. When the baby finally came wailing her fury at being forced from warmth into cold air, Nate went absolutely still. The sound transported him back 15 years to another birth, another child, another woman who had called his name in the dark and received only silence because he had chosen money over presence. "Nathan," Ellie's voice cut through the memory, "look at her." The doctor placed the baby in Ellie's arms, this tiny creature with a face red from crying and fists waving in protest at the indignity of existence. She had dark hair like her mother, and what Nate suspected would be her father's stubborn jaw once she grew into it. "A daughter," the doctor said, washing his hands. "Healthy lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for. You've got yourself a fine girl, Crawford." Nate couldn't speak, couldn't move. All he could do was stare at this child, this living proof that good things could still happen, that death didn't always win, that sometimes the universe gave you a second chance you didn't deserve but needed desperately. "Do you want to hold her?" Ellie asked softly. He shook his head, terrified he would break her drop, her somehow taint her with the grief he still carried. But Ellie shifted the baby toward him anyway, placed the warm weight in his arms with the confidence of a woman who knew what she was doing. The baby stopped crying, just looked up at him with eyes that couldn't quite focus yet, that saw only shadows and light, that held no judgment for his failures or his past. She was perfect, unmarked by the world's cruelty, a blank page waiting to be written with love instead of loss. "Thank God," Nate whispered the words coming from somewhere deep and broken. "Thank God you're both alive." Martha stood in the doorway, wiping her eyes with her apron. Joe appeared behind her, took one look at the scene, and quietly disappeared to tell the boys they had a sister. The doctor packed his bag and left instructions for feeding and care that Martha would follow, because she had helped raise half the children in the county and knew what to do even when new mothers didn't. "She needs a name," Ellie said after the doctor left after Martha had cleaned everything and dimmed the lamps and given them privacy. "What were you thinking?" Nate asked, still cradling the baby like she might evaporate if he relaxed his grip. "I was thinking we should name her after someone important, someone who gave you the capacity to love again even if you lost her too soon. Sarah." The name hurt coming out, but it was a good hurt, the kind that meant healing instead of festering. Sarah Eleanor Crawford, after the woman who taught you kindness and the woman who taught you to fight for it. Nate looked at his wife, this woman who had been a stranger 9 months ago and was now the center of his world, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the sudden lightning strike of first love, but something deeper, steadier. The kind of love built brick by brick through shared struggle and daily choosing. "I love you," he said, the words surprising him as much as her. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you, Ellie Crawford." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I love you too, have for months, was just too scared to say it." They kissed over their daughter's head, gentle and careful two people who had learned that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up every day, about running into burning barns and holding hands through labor and choosing each other when the world said to quit. The boys met their sister the next morning. Daniel approached with the careful reverence of a 9-year-old who understood that babies were fragile. Matthew was fascinated by her tiny fingers. Benjamin immediately declared he would protect her from all dangers forever. "What's her name?" Daniel asked. "Sarah Eleanor," Nate said, "but we'll call her Sarah to keep things simple." "Hi, Sarah," Daniel said, softly touching one small hand. "I'm your big brother, Daniel. I'm going to teach you everything I know, how to ride horses and rope cattle and stand up to bullies. You're going to be the strongest girl in Wyoming." Nate pulled Daniel close with his free arm. "You're going to be a good brother. I learned from the best papa." The word hung in the air. Papa. Not Mr. Nate anymore, not Crawford, Papa. Daniel had been using it since the courthouse, but hearing it in this moment with his daughter in his arms and his wife beside him, and the future stretching out like an unwritten story, it hit different. "Thank you," Nate said quietly, "for letting me be that for you. You earned it. When you stood up in court, when you called us yours, when you kept us safe even when it cost everything." Daniel's voice was thick with emotion. "Papa would have wanted us to have a father who stays, who fights for us. You're that father." Spring came early that year, melting snow and bringing green back to the plains. The ranch recovered from the fire slowly but steadily. They rebuilt the barn bigger and better with stone foundation and fire breaks. The cattle sale brought enough profit to pay the mortgage with money left over. Ranch families stayed loyal, and new workers arrived seeking employment at the place where a man had run into fire to save his horses and a woman had run in after him. By summer, Red Mesa Ranch was more prosperous than it had ever been. But the real wealth wasn't in cattle or land. It was in the family that gathered for dinner every evening, in the laughter of children learning their letters from Ellie's patient teaching, in the steady rhythm of work and rest and love that made each day worth living. Marcus Harland was sentenced to 25 years, hard labor at the Territorial Prison in Laramie. Reverend Stone fled to Nebraska, where he was eventually caught and defrocked. His career in manipulating faithful congregations ended by his own greed. Their conspiracy became cautionary tale proof that justice existed even when the powerful thought themselves beyond its reach. The years passed in the way years do when they're full. Daniel grew tall and capable, taking on more ranch responsibility, until Nate made him junior foreman at 16. Matthew discovered a gift for numbers and began handling the ranch accounts. Benjamin became the best horseman any of them had ever seen, gentle and intuitive with animals, in ways that seemed almost magical. And Sarah, little Sarah, who had been born from hope and fear and desperate love, grew into a force of nature, smart as her mother, stubborn as her father, and fearless as any of her brothers. By the time she was 5, she was demanding to learn everything they learned. By 10, she could rope and ride and shoot as well as boys twice her age. By 15, she was arguing for women's suffrage and driving Martha to distraction with talk of college and independence. On a warm June evening in 1908, the entire Crawford clan gathered at Red Mesa Ranch for Nate's 64th birthday. The ranch had expanded over the years now, encompassing twice the land and 3 times the cattle. The main house had been added onto, creating space for the growing family. Daniel and his wife Margaret had 3 children. Matthew and his wife Clara had 2. Benjamin, who had married a veterinarian's daughter from Cheyenne, was expecting his first. Sarah, 25 and still unmarried, despite numerous suitors, worked as a teacher in town and spent her free time organizing rallies for women's rights. Joe Whitaker, now 93 and moving slow but still sharp as ever, sat in his favorite chair watching the chaos of grandchildren running through the house. Martha, 81 and still ruling the kitchen with an iron fist, coordinated the dinner preparation with the help of daughters-in-law who had learned not to question her methods. Nate stood on the porch watching it all, feeling the weight of years in his bones, but also the satisfaction of a life well lived. His leg still ached on cold morning's legacy of the barn fire, but he had survived when he wasn't supposed to, had built something lasting when everyone said he was finished. Ellie appeared beside him, 51 now, and still beautiful, in ways that had nothing to do with age. She took his hand the way she had every day for 25 years. The simple gesture of partnership that had become so natural, neither thought about it anymore. "Happy birthday, old man. We're the same age." "Yes, but you look older." He laughed, pulled her close. "What would I do without you?" "Die of stubbornness, probably, or forget to eat breakfast." She leaned against him, comfortable in his arms. "Do you ever think about that night when I was on my knees in the snow and you stopped?" "Every day. Best decision I ever made." "Even though it nearly destroyed you? Even though Marcus almost won? Even though, because it led to this." He gestured at the house full of noise and life and love. "To 25 years of being married to you. To 4 children and 6 grandchildren with more on the way and counting. To a ranch that means something because it's built on more than just profit." Daniel called from inside that dinner was ready. The family began gathering around the massive table they'd had built to accommodate everyone. Children claimed seats while adults organized the chaos. Speech, someone called, probably Joe. The patriarch needs to make a speech. Nate wanted to refuse, uncomfortable with attention, even after all these years. But Ellie squeezed his hand and he found himself standing at the head of the table, looking at faces he loved more than his own life. "I'm not good with words," he began, and several people laughed because it was true. "But there are some things worth saying." He looked at each of his children in turn. 25 years ago, I was a dead man walking, alive in body but gone where it mattered. Then your mother came into my life with 3 boys and $17 and more courage than any soldier I ever served with. "I thought it was $18, Daniel said with a grin. "Felt like 17 after I gave Marcus 300. Scattered laughter, but gentle. Marcus was long dead, his cruelty fading into cautionary tale rather than fresh wound. "Your mother and I, we didn't start with love. We started with necessity, with a practical arrangement to save her from a bad man and give her boys a home. But somewhere along the way, between the fire and the courthouse and the 1,000 small choices we made to stand by each other, necessity became something else. It became partnership, then friendship, then love, the deepest, truest kind, because it was earned, not just felt." He had to pause, emotion making his voice rough. "I used to think I'd had my one chance at family with Sarah, that losing her meant I was done. But what I learned is that the heart doesn't work that way. Love isn't a limited resource. It's something that grows the more you give it away." He looked at Ellie. "You taught me that, you and the boys. You taught me that broken things can be remade into something stronger than they were before. That mistakes don't define us, choices do. That family isn't about blood, it's about who you choose to stand beside when everything's burning." Sarah, his daughter, stood suddenly. "Papa, I want to say something." "Of course, sweetheart." She came to stand beside him, this fierce young woman who carried pieces of him and Ellie and all the struggle that had gone into making her. "I grew up hearing the story of how you and Mama met, how Uncle Marcus tried to take everything, How you stood in fire, how Mama ran in after you, how Daniel saved you both with that letter. And for a long time I thought it was a story about rescue, about a strong man saving a helpless woman. But I was wrong. It was never about rescue. It was about choice. About two people choosing to fight together instead of alone. About building something real from materials that should have produced nothing but disaster. She turned to address the whole family. That's the legacy of this family. Not the ranch or the land or the money. The legacy is that when life tried to break us, we broke the world instead. We rewrote the rules. We made our own definitions of what family means. And now look at us. Daniel runs this ranch with Papa, equal partners. Matthew teaches math at the school Mama started. Benjamin heals animals because Papa taught him that kindness is strength. And me, she smiled, fierce and proud, I fight for other women to have the choices Mama had, to stand beside men as partners, not behind them as possessions. That's what you gave us, Mama and Papa. Not just life, not just home, but the courage to choose who we become. And we choose to be like you, every day, in every way that matters. The table erupted in agreement, voices overlapping with affirmation and love. Nate found he couldn't speak, too overwhelmed by the reality that this family and this legacy, this enormous, beautiful, complicated thing, had grown from one moment of choosing to help instead of passing by. After dinner, after the children were put to bed and the adults had moved to the porch with coffee and quiet conversation, Nate sat with Ellie, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. "A few?" "I wish I'd been there for Sarah when she died. I wish I'd stood up to Marcus sooner. I wish I'd told you I loved you months before I did. But overall, I'd do it all again, every choice, every mistake, every moment of fear and doubt, because it led here, to you, to this family, to a life worth living, instead of just surviving." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only came after decades of knowing someone so well that words became optional. From inside they could hear Joe telling the grandchildren stories, his voice carrying through the open windows. Martha laughing at something, one of the daughters-in-law said. Daniel and Margaret arguing gently about ranch business, the normal sounds of a family at peace. "I love you," Ellie said, softly. "More than I did yesterday. Less than I will tomorrow. That's the thing about this kind of love. It just keeps growing. I know what you mean. Sometimes I look at you and can't believe you're real, that I get to wake up next to you every morning, that I get to build this life with you. You saved me, you know, that night in the snow. No? You saved yourself. I just gave you a chance to prove what you were capable of. We saved each other then, and we keep saving each other every day, in all the small ways that matter more than the big ones." 25 years of marriage condensed into that simple truth. They had saved each other. Not once in some grand, dramatic gesture, but repeatedly, constantly, in choices so small they barely registered, until you added them all together and realized they'd built a cathedral. The next morning, Nate woke early as always. His body had never adjusted to sleeping past dawn, despite Ellie's suggestions that he take it easy, now that Daniel handled most of the ranch work. He dressed quietly, kissed his still sleeping wife's forehead, and went out to watch the sunrise. Joe found him there, the old man, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to accommodate age, but refused to surrender to it. "Couldn't sleep either?" Joe asked. "Slept fine. Just wanted to see another sunrise. Never get tired of them. 65 years old. Never thought you'd make it this far. Not after Sarah died. Neither did I. You did good, Nate. Better than good. You built something that'll last. We built it, you and Martha and Ellie and all of us together. Maybe. But you're the foundation. You chose to help when everyone said to walk away. You chose to fight when everyone said to quit. You chose to love when everyone said you were too broken." Joe's voice was rough with age and emotion. "That's what makes you a good man. Not that you never fell down, but that you got back up. And you helped others get up too." They stood together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, two old soldiers who had fought their wars and earned their peace, who had lived long enough to see that goodness could win. Sometimes that love could conquer, sometimes that second chances existed for people brave enough to take them. Later that day, Nate took his camera, a newfangled contraption Daniel had bought him for his birthday, and gathered the entire family on the front porch. 4 generations crammed together, children wiggling, and adults trying to hold still everyone connected by blood or choice or both. "Smile," he said, peering through the viewfinder, "and remember this. Remember that we're all here because 25 years ago, your grandmother said yes to a broken man with a burned ranch and a desperate plan. Remember that family is what you make it. Remember that love is a choice you make every day." The shutter clicked. The moment was captured, frozen in silver and light, preserved for the future generations who would look at this photograph and wonder about the stories behind these faces. Years later, when Nate Crawford died peacefully in his sleep at 71, surrounded by family, his last words were reportedly about Ellie, about how he'd been the luckiest man alive, about how one good choice could change everything, about how love was the only thing that mattered in the end. Ellie lived another 17 years after him, dying at 75 with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around her bed. Her last words, according to Daniel, who never left her side, were simpler. "Thank you for everything, for the life we built, for the love we shared, for proving that broken things can heal if you give them time and care and the courage to try again." They buried them together at Red Mesa Ranch, side by side, overlooking the land they had built into something lasting. Above the graves, Daniel placed a marker with an inscription that captured everything his parents had taught him. Nathan Crawford, Eleanor Crawford, partners, fighters, survivors. Proof that love is a choice made daily, that family is built, not born, that courage means standing beside someone when the world burns and refusing to let go. Red Mesa Ranch still operates today, run by their great-great-grandchildren who carry on the legacy of honest work and chosen family. The main house has been expanded again to accommodate reunions that bring together over 100 descendants. The barn rebuilt after the fire still stands with a bronze plaque telling the story of the night Nate ran into flames and Ellie ran in after him. But the real legacy isn't the ranch or the house or even the family tree that is spread across Wyoming and beyond. The real legacy is simpler and more profound. It's the understanding that love isn't about rescue. It's about partnership, about choosing to stand beside someone and fight together instead of alone, about building something lasting from materials that should have produced only disaster. It's about looking at someone on their knees in the snow and deciding to stop, to help, to offer not charity, but opportunity, to see worth where others saw burden. It's about accepting that help even when pride screams to refuse it, about trusting even when trust has been broken, about choosing to fight for a future instead of surrendering to circumstance. It's about running into fire for someone you barely know because they're yours now, and that means something. It's about getting up after being knocked down and trying again, choosing again, loving again. Above the main gate at Red Mesa Ranch, a sign hangs that has been there since 1900 and 9 placed there by Daniel and his siblings in honor of their parents. Love is a choice. Choose wisely. Choose daily. Build something lasting. That was Nathan and Eleanor Crawford's legacy, and it endures.